We talk about hope for the future that starts today. As Dr. Pioro said, we don't know what causes this disease. But if you use a rather simplistic analogy of a rock thrown in a pond, we don't know what that rock is. But we're trying very hard until we've identified the source of the disease to damp down the waves that follow from the rock, including those waves that sort of feed back on themselves. This is an inordinately complex disease, as most neurodegenerative diseases are, as all of them are. And we're making progress in beginning to figure out how to damp those waves and extend survival and quality of life so that, as Dr. Pioro said, maybe we can turn this into an MS-like disease or an oncology type disease and improve quality of life along the way. That is our goal. Here's the iconic figure of Lou Gehrig giving his luckiest man speech. And another hero in the lexicon or the legacy of Knopp, Walter Knopp, our namesake. There was some discussion in the previous talk during the Q&A about biomarkers for ALS. Some of those early candidate biomarkers for diagnosing the disease through an in vitro diagnostic test were discovered at Pitt by Dr. Bob Bowser. Dr. Bowser's work was funded through a very visionary gift from Walter Knopp. My company, Knopp Neurosciences, was initially formed, and I was among the co-founders, to license and commercialize those diagnostic biomarkers whose discovery had been financed by Mr. Knopp. So when we formed the company around that particular technology, we thought it was only appropriate that we honor him for the vision he had in supporting that research. Now, it came to pass that in our early work on those biomarkers, we identified a drug candidate that was worthy of testing in the disease. And I think we all recognize that as important as it is to get earlier and more definitive diagnosis of this disease, we need to have more effective treatments as well. So they go hand in hand, and most of our company's resources are now focused on the development of a drug to address the disease. Our mission, in fact, is to fill unmet medical needs. That's what we're about. We are a company of 18 people that has raised $30 million in private money, no government money. This is from investors on Wall Street and elsewhere who think that we can move the dial in this disease. But our team is physicians, entrepreneurs, clinical development experts, neuroscientists who all share a passion for one thing: unmet medical needs. We're not about creating a drug for some lifestyle issue, the kind of thing that you see advertised on the football games all the time, for example. We're about unmet medical needs. And we do this, even though we're a small team, through collaboration with other authorities, academics, other large organizations. We emphasize innovation and, frankly, humility. And it's very easy to be humble when you're approaching a disease like ALS. Now, since Dr. Bozic was going to give this talk, I'll share an anecdote that he often begins his discussions with. Mike is a neurologist who did fellowship in clinical practice in oncology. He was a neuro-oncologist, a brain cancer specialist, before he came into the ALS business. And he often tells people, citing a particular pediatric, or predominantly pediatric, cancer here called ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, that if you look at this chart and the bottom line, that's the percentage of children that survived year by year after their diagnosis in 1963. You can see that it was extremely high mortality in years 1, 2, and 3. But you go to the second line, and then the third line, and the fourth line, which was 1993, as advances in the molecular pathology of this disease and in the clinical support and even palliative support of this disease advanced. Look how that survival curve changed. in what was once a death sentence for children. Now here, we've had just a few minutes ago some very interesting discussions about Rilutech, or Riluzole by its generic name. This is the Kaplan-Meier curve for the study on which the drug was approved. And without going into the details, you can see that that fairly small survival benefit for which the drug was approved is present in this chart. We need to raise the slope of that line. We want the next effective drug to have a Kaplan-Meier curve that looks something like this. And then we want the drug after that to have a curve that looks something like this. And by the way, it's unlikely that any single drug may accomplish all this. It may be, whether it's supplements or multiple approved proprietary pharmaceuticals, it's likely, as it is in complex diseases like cancer, to require a cocktail approach to flattening out this line, much less one day reversing it. Now, Dr. Piero showed a cartoon of the molecular mechanisms of what's known about ALS, and he said it was a simplified version. This is an even more simplified version, as I'm sure he would agree. The point here is that we've achieved some significant advances in the last 10 years in understanding the molecular mechanisms of ALS. But there is no single pathway that seems to predominate, much less account for all or even most of the disease. Excitatory amino acid toxicity, which is something that Rilutech is thought to address. We have some new questions about Rilutech that I'll raise in a second about its mechanism. The inflammation pathology of ALS is being very well established. Abnormal protein processing. Dr. Piero mentioned that these aggregates of proteins that occur in cells seems to be an issue in ALS. And as he also mentioned, mitochondrial dysfunction is gaining prominence as a significant factor in the disease. The drugs that are now in development, drugs and other treatments, this is sort of color-coded according to each of those mechanistic pathways on the previous figure, are based on rational approaches. That is to say, it's the pharmaceutical industry's term for looking at a mechanism or a target and working backward to find a chemical structure that will modify that pathological activity. So rather than taking a shotgun approach, the pharmaceutical industry and its academic collaborators are taking more a rifle shot approach in identifying particular mechanisms and then trying to find particular compounds that will affect that particular mechanism. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit on one of those four pathways in particular, although actually they all intersect, and there's a point at which they all overlap. And that is what happens in the mitochondria of patients with neurodegenerative disease. And I'll talk about the compound that we're developing to try to address that mitochondrial dysfunction, which we know by the name KNS 760704.